Welcome to another Redline Twitter space. This one looking at the Brics summit that just happened over the week and what this means for global geopolitics going forward. We have an absolutely fantastic panel with us here this evening. We have Maximilian Hess, who's a political risk and geopolitics analyst at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Also has an amazing book out in the United States on the 15th of September called Economic War, easily one of my favorite books this year. We also have Rachel Ziemba, who's a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, who's an absolutely fantastic analyst in both the financial sense and also the geopolitics. And we also have Genevieve Donnellon-May, who is a research associate at the Asia Society and also the Redline's Asia Pacific desk. So I'm going to throw to Max first, though. How would you sum up the Brics summit that we just saw? What is the big news to come out of it? And is anything unexpected to come out of it?
Well, thank you again for having us. Certainly the big news to come out of it is the invitation to expand the membership of the Brics grouping quite significantly. But, I think that the actual fundamental news is that there still are inherent divides amongst the Brics members about where they see this organization going. Brics often gets headline news attention, but a lot of analysis and discussion, in my opinion, fails to take into account the lack of underlying institutional framework within the organization itself, as well as real questions about where it's headed in the future. And so certainly since I sit here with a bit of my Russia watcher hat on, many of the things that the Kremlin in particular had been hoping for did not materialize. Of course, one of the main bits of news is that Vladimir Putin himself could not attend this summit, a summit that he claims and many of his other proponents claim is meant to demonstrate a shifting and emergent new world order, particularly on the economic front, is still so constrained by the existing world order that Putin is forced to join via video link. So, I think the headline is that this is a signaling attempt by many of the countries that are already members, but then also some of the aspirant members as well, which is why we've seen sort of some mixed statements on plans to actually join in the following. But, if we fall for signaling attempts without truly analyzing what's going on internally, then I think, we're doing a little better than repeating the messages that they want to be repeated. And I worry that of the media coverage has been exactly that. So very happy to be part of this space and to get to challenge some of those views and hear others' thoughts on it.
So the members that we've seen who've been accepted to join are Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. So Rachel, I'm going to throw this to you. Why these countries? There was apparently a lot that applied, whether it be Kazakhstan or, why are these 6 countries joining Brics when others were not allowed to join?
Yeah, so I think you're right. Who's not there is as interesting as who is there. So I've described the new joiners, or we'll see what happens, as a bit of a motley crew. I think there are 2 sort of different groups of countries that were asked to join: Saudi Arabia and the UAE, major kind of capital sources, major player, major countries that are already in their own way trying to hedge and push against, sort of what had been very sort of U.S. driven foreign policy. And then there's a whole bunch of countries that are either already financially reliant on Brics countries or are financially reliant on countries that are about to join. So sizable economies, yes, but we're talking about sort of a number of countries, Ethiopia, Argentina just had yet another IMF deal, sort of Egypt, very much reliant on financing. What I thought, so I think that divergence, if anything, adds to the rhetoric, but only raises a question about sort of whether there can be joint sort of action across the group. And so maybe we're going to see a little bit of sort of small groups emerging out of this. What I really was taken with was that there weren't any new Asian entrants, and Indonesia in particular, I know, has been sort of public about saying, well, wait, we don't want to join yet. They want to consult with ASEAN. I imagine they're also trying to wait and see what happens on talking about the US with critical minerals with the United States. And even Saudi Arabia, I I think, is sort of trying to use this as a bit of a hedge as they talk to sort of the US and sort of balance between the US and China and US and Israel and others in that sort of context. And of course, the fact that Iran, yet another, is a country that's even more sanctioned from an economic perspective than Russia, has been joined. I mean, really, it strikes me that it's very limited how far these, sort of these countries as a group can go. So there's a lot of will to push back against sort of the Western rule-based order, but I think it's harder to do in practice. And so we'll really have to watch and see what happens individually, bilaterally, and I'm a little more skeptical what can happen about this set of countries as a group.
So Genevieve, each one of the BRICS members has a veto power, and they can veto any laws that come up through this. Now, looking at the new guest list, we have Egypt and Ethiopia have beef over the Nile River. We also have Iran and Saudi Arabia, quite famously have a quite contentious relationship. Do you think that letting these new members in is likely to slow progress down, as we're now having members who have direct opposite geopolitical goals to each other inside the organization?
That's a really interesting question. I think that we could see it both ways, actually, because in recent years we've seen the UAE restore diplomatic relations with Iran, and then also a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and these three countries are now all part of BRICS. And we also know that these three countries, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, have also been able to relatively put aside any differences as member of OPEC. So perhaps we could be asking the question, well, why can't they do the same in the BRICS bloc? And I guess in this light, regional issues are perhaps more unlikely to be a focus, and it would also disadvantage them, particularly in the case of Iran, which, as Rachel and Max have already mentioned, is under quite a number of sanctions. And so that Iran, in this case, would be unlikely to want to cause any trouble. So I think on one hand that tensions can be managed. After all, economic ties and trade, money really often trumps. So having said that, tensions are still the main reason, or one of the reasons why BRICS is really unlikely to go ahead with the idea that Russia had, which is to establish a common currency to replace the US dollar. We see this particularly in the case of China, India, but I'm sure that we could see it in the case of Egypt and Ethiopia. What Cairo wants, Addis Ababa is not going to want to push forward as well. So I think that although tensions can be managed, I think that some, unfortunately, may spill over.
So, Max, Russia was pushing to get Iran into the organization. Brazil was pushing for Argentina. Why would Russia be pushing for Iran to join this organization? What do they get out of this?
Well, I think that Russia and almost all of the other members, and we can see in the ultimate invite list, back these countries for their own strategic reasons, which again are primarily signaling. Russia wants to show to Iran that it can continue to be a reliable partner despite it itself coming under sanctions, that their cooperation, whether it be in production of drones or potentially in the energy sector, is an area that can bear fruit for them. So, I think for the Kremlin, Iran being under those similar sanctions, and it's particularly keen to have Tehran as a member to show that sort of this, those concerns don't apply there. We've seen statements from Indian ministers and the like in particular, criticizing the idea of expanding the bloc to include sanctioned members, but other countries got their ones to join as well. And I think that really speaks to some of the issues that Russia has had. And yes, it had this signaling success with, getting the Iran invitation, but the South African minister had announced just on the eve of the summit that they wouldn't even seriously be discussing the currency position with some of the other countries that are invited. It was already mentioned, but Egypt and Argentina are the number 2 and the number 1 countries in terms of indebtedness to the IMF, and while China has granted a swap line, exchanging yuan for local currency with Argentina, that's really just to help it manage its payments in dollars to that. And then, of course, if Saudi Arabia and the UAE ultimately do join and do so without, and certainly I don't think that membership in BRICS would be anywhere near worth them reconsidering this, and I don't think that they would say so either, but without adjusting their currencies, which operate currency baskets but effectively pegs to the dollar and a handful of other hard currencies, that makes it a complete non-starter for BRICS to become the basis of any other rival currency. And then it also will raise questions.
So I'm going to throw this question to Rachel here. Now, these economies that are in BRICS are very different economies. When you look at an organization like G7, they're actually fairly similar economies. These countries who are joining BRICS are very different economies. And on top of that, China is 62% of the entire current GDP of BRICS. Is this an organization that is, everyone gets an equal vote, or is this a China-led organization?
Well, I mean, so I think it has been a China-led organization. I think we also have to look honestly at how much the BRICS as a group accomplished, as opposed to it's always hard from an international relations perspective to figure out what happens just because certain groups of countries are meeting, right? Whether they're bilateral ties that materialize and the like. But when you look at it, yes, they've created the new development bank, which is one of the smallest sort of multilateral development banks, but has 25 billion in loans. But they're not a lot of sort of big accomplishments so far. Going forward, we might see more. I have a feeling that what's going to happen more here, especially because of the bilateral ties with China and the issues of the sanctions, is that we might see the BRICS becoming a unit for some more subgroupings to sort of develop. This is also a reaction to the fact that the G20 is really so divided that it's hard to get anything sort of done there. I used to look back at the BRICS and say that each country's bilateral ties with China were more important than their ties with each other. Now, that may be starting to shift when we think about the bilateral trade between Russia and India, for example, particularly in the context of the way that the sanctions and the G7 price cap have reoriented trade there. But Max, when he's back on, well, I'm sure we'll have things to say about that bilateral relationship. So I think ultimately all of these argue again, sort of make it difficult for the group as a whole to make decisions. But I think this issue, especially of de-dollarization, is one that's really important for us to neither overestimate nor underestimate. The will and desire for countries to have some alternative to the dollar is increasing, and this is not exactly new. There have been lots of moments in the last sort of several decades where there's been a lot of anti-dollar sort of sentiment. It's a function both of US and G7 weaponization of the dollar, but it's also a function of the Federal Reserve and G10 central banks really sort of setting global monetary conditions. So that will is definitely there. But I still think you have China, for example, uncertain about the loss of control that a much greater use of the renminbi internationally would imply. There's a lot of domestic things that they're sort of focusing on. So, sort of back to your original question of sort of, is this sort of going to stay China dominated, and, how do the votes work? I think ultimately, if things go forward, it's going to be because, sort of China on the currency side, it's going to be because China's testing something out. And at the end of the day, anything that's formal, yes, all the countries have to vote on. And that makes me think that if there's any sort of new development, it's going to be sort of more informal or smaller groups that materialize out of this sort of convening power.
So Genevieve, one of your fields of expertise. Yeah, I was going to say that's what I'm going to add on to that, and I'm going to ask you about a bit of commodity trade as well.
Yeah, sure. So adding on to all of the great points that Rachel has made, I think what we may also see is that China will likely want to continue having, or either having the most power in BRICS or being able to call the shots. But I think perhaps we'll also see India, which is also interested in strengthening relations with the global south, and is also interested in multipolarity. And we know that New Delhi, based on the various other issues that it's facing with Beijing, such as the territory disputes, the border disputes, New Delhi is unlikely to want to cede any ground, including any kind of outreach that China makes via BRICS. We also know that India sees itself as a third pole, and this affects its relationship with BRICS as an economic bloc, as well as with the different member countries in it, and as well as with Beijing. So perhaps we will see India wanting to make some kind of outreach to the countries, or having more of a say in the countries that China wants to invite into BRICS as well. And New Delhi will perhaps try to find some way to be able to reduce the effectiveness of Beijing's outreach.
So I'm going to throw this question to Max first, and I'll probably come back to Genevieve on it afterwards.
Yes.
But people have been wondering what this organization is likely to look like. Is it going to be like a Shanghai cooperation organization that, frankly, there's lots of members and not a lot gets done? Is it going to be more like a EU, where it's a tight-knit group and lots get done, or is it going to be more like an OPEC, where frankly it's mostly around trading commodities rather than internal domestic politics across the nations?
So I think that hopefully you can hear me better now. But I think
That's
that
better, yeah.
the most immediate comparison of those is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And for those who aren't familiar, that is an organization originally backed by Beijing, also with some support from Moscow. There have been some tensions that handles a lot of relations and dialogue in Central Asia, which recently has had South Asian countries and Iran join as observer members as well. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does not have fundamental trade liberalization as part of it or key policy coordination, and that's where I expect Brics is headed. I actually think that the expansion to include all of these members further, if they do join, further muddies the potential for Brics to become an alternative to the IMF and World Bank and the sort of international economic order that many of its members actually are united by. India is certainly a key third power and is not in the Western or in the Russian and certainly not in the Chinese blocs. But we've seen Prime Minister Modi repeatedly talk about his own desire for alternatives. But even then, India puts its interests first. Its trade with Russia for oil comes at substantial discounts, but India never agreed the swap mechanism between the ruble and the rupee that the Kremlin wanted. China also didn't agree to Russia's full request there separately. And so for Brics to really become an alternative, it needs the economic institutions that have been at the core of this. And Genevieve and Rachel, both mentioned some of the historical challenges for unaligned countries, going back to the Cold War in Yugoslavia and Indonesia and a number of others, but also at some points India. And for developing countries, there's long been criticism about the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, and a number of other facts of the international economic order that have existed for a long time. Dollar dominance has become quite a bit more of the story since the 1990s, when I argue that the U.S. really began to establish significant hegemony over the international economic order. It certainly began being built up a long time. But for me, the sort of, bit that this all reminds of is in 1974, as we were in not an entirely different situation.
So Max, so Genevieve, I'm going to circle back to you before I get to Rachel after that. You do quite a lot of work on food security and commodities trade as well. A lot of people have been pitching this as maybe a new OPEC for more commodities than just oil, because a lot of these guys are trading commodities between them. How likely do you think it is that this ends up almost a commodity trading ground or commodity negotiation ground between some of these states?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So at present, I would say there's definitely interest in food, particularly soybeans, from both China's perspective and Brazil's, but also from India as well. And I think that there's two main aspects. So one would obviously be oil. If we look at the inclusion of major oil producing countries, when it comes to oil, and the economic bloc Brics now counts for over 40% of oil production, of global oil production. So that's enormous. And that's not even including potential production expansion with what we could see in Iran, for instance. And so when it looks like that when selecting new members, Brics bloc may have taken into consideration also the pricing of energy products and also how their countries can reduce their liability and vulnerability in terms of the cost of oil, particularly with the exception of Russia. All of the core Brics countries are non-energy producing countries. They need to be able to make their economies function, but they obviously don't want to get caught up in the secondary collateral damage of sanctions. And of course, the sanctions, as I mentioned earlier, it's something that the continued dominance of the US dollar in global trade is something that Brics has vocally challenged in the past. So that would be the first point. Now, the second point would also be about food or agricultural production. We've seen the ongoing ramifications of the Ukraine-Russia war, particularly what that means for imports in not only various African countries, but also in Asian countries, including Indonesia, actually, which are quite reliant on wheat as well as corn and soybean imports from Ukraine and or Russia. And so that's part of the issue, as well as because it's made grain prices in particular fluctuate. And there's also fears amid all of the doom and gloom, there's also fears of a potential rice shortage as well. And so with BRICS, we can see that the current members, including the new ones, that the group now has over 50% of the world's corn export supplies, and with an estimated 500 million metric tons of production potential. So that would be one for corn. Then if we look at wheat, we can also see that the economic bloc, including new members, has more than 30% of the world's wheat export supplies, and also a significant amount in terms of both soybean and soybean meal production due to Brazil and Argentina. And of course, China and India, they have enormous populations. Food security is a very high priority for both Prime Minister Modi, there's a general election, as well as various state elections in India next year, as well as, of course, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and that, of course, relates back to the Chinese Communist Party's ability to be able to feed the population as part of the reason why it has perhaps been able to stay in power for so long. And so with these strong interests in food security, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see more developments related to this, whether it's the form in some kind of free trade agreement between the countries or between the BRICS bloc, or also in terms of some kind of food security cooperation mechanism. From what I've heard, Brazil is particularly interested in that, and again, so is China. So that could be something interesting to look out for in coming months or years.
It is indeed. Rachel, now one of your fields of expertise is in macroeconomics and massive global trend lines. When we're looking at the guys that are joining the BRICS coming up, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are quite financially well off. Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina have all taken pretty bad financial statements recently, even taking massive loans to bail themselves out. What does it say for the organization that these guys are bringing in countries that are in financial distress at the moment? And do you think that indicates the direction the organization is likely to head?
Yeah, so before I answer that, if I may, I just wanted to kind of amplify a point that Genevieve made and so on, or just sort of respond to a point, which is, I think there's going to be a lot of focus on the sort of commodity importer and producer sort of question, and we could well see countries endorsing some kind of food security initiative. But I do think it's important to be conscious of the fact that even among the existing BRICS countries, there wasn't necessarily a lot of bilateral trade. So, for example, South Africa, most of their agricultural products go to developed economies, and it's not just a distant story, and where they have sort of better free trade access than in China and India. So just because countries are joining and have these resources doesn't necessarily mean that this will be the grouping where they choose to negotiate the contract. So I think it's something really important to put on the table and something we should be watching, but it doesn't necessarily directly follow that this will create some kind of a cartel or a buyers sort of either a buyers club. But it is significant that you have both buyers and sellers of these key commodities at a time when many of these countries are trying to grapple with a world order where Western sanctions and the like have rerouted a lot of key commodity trade, have established a whole set of discounts. So, but not to take too much time, sort of your point, I think that there are different reasons why these two different groups of countries were invited in. Saudi Arabia and the UAE not only might provide a bit of a sort of lifeline and financing for a new development bank, the BRICS Bank, which has really struggled to access dollars in part because Russia is a shareholder. There might well be sort of new capital injections there. I also think that some of the existing and maybe future BRICS countries might like to have some of these countries that are on sort of their financial life support come into this group to sort of better manage and create joint opportunities there. Ethiopia and Egypt, for example, get a lot of funding, not only Egypt from the IMF and from the Gulf, but Ethiopia, a lot of interest from the Gulf countries, lots of investment from China. So I think at the end of the day, one of the reasons the BRICS countries decided to keep meeting because they looked around and said, and they responded to the Goldman Sachs argument, which was that emerging economies didn't have enough weight in global financial institutions, and arguably that is still the case. I think there's going to be challenges scaling that up and doing that in a consistent way. But this is also coming at a time when China is not investing as much in Belt and Road projects as they were 5 or sort of 8 years ago, the sort of capital outflows for development like spending are falling back. That's partly a function of China's economic sort of inward challenges, but also those dynamics. So it's not to say that they're stopping investment, but they're being more parsimonious. And so that might well be part of this desire of bringing in other countries in this way. And I do think back to where we started and a point that Max made, a lot of this expansion is a function of rhetoric. It's also a function of a lot of creativity and attempts to create new global institutions, small groups that might deal with a small area, and sort of we'll see what they do. I think all of us on this call are sort of cautious about how much institutions the BRICS will actually make, because it's important to remember that even though they're meeting, there are not a lot of sort of standing secretariats or institutions that create, and not a lot of willingness to yield sovereignty to the group as a whole, as of course we've seen in regional organizations like the European Union or any trade relationship.
Yeah. If I can add one point to what Rachel said.
So, Genevieve, I'm going to throw this question to you then. Looking at the members who didn't get the nod and didn't get to join, that would be countries like Algeria, Bolivia, Indonesia, Cuba, the DRC, Comoros, Gabon, Kazakhstan. Do you see any of those likely to join in an upcoming BRICS coming up, or frankly, they're going to struggle with the members they have at the moment?
Again, interesting question. I thought Indonesia was actually quite an interesting one from what I have been hearing in Jakarta in particular, that Indonesia was using BRICS to be able to highlight its own, or to highlight the usefulness of diplomatic institutions to be able to advance the Indonesian president's priorities. And we saw this with both the G20 and ASEAN. And also some of the topics that the Indonesian president raised at the recent BRICS summit also have strong domestic relevance for Indonesia. So one about his point about trade discrimination that can be linked to protests against the European Union's palm oil restrictions against not only Malaysia, but also against Indonesia too. Similarly, we also saw his comments about combating food security. We can link that into fertilizer shortage concerns and also the current fears of a rice shortage. So why wasn't Indonesia welcomed, or why wasn't that approved? Again, interesting questions. One argument could be that perhaps the benefits of Indonesia formally joining BRICS are far from clear. As both Max and Rachel have mentioned a couple of times, that, what has BRICS achieved? I think it would be quite difficult to be able to say that. Similarly, there are issues present with the new development bank. So perhaps even if Jakarta does intend to further reinforce its efforts at both foreign policy and economic diversification, which of course a number of countries, including Australia and others, are pursuing, that BRICS membership perhaps is just not the best option for Indonesia at that stage. Having said that, we might also see in the future, again, with not only Indonesia, but a number of other countries, that BRICS membership could give them another forum to advocate for a more multipolar world and strengthen economic ties. Indonesia, of course, already does this with their diverse array of institutions like ASEAN, G20, and also MICA. So that's with Mexico, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. Of course, it's also been able to exercise leadership in other areas. So, for instance, it had a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council between 2019 and 2021, and also was chair of the Indian Ocean Rim Association in between 2015 and 2017. What I didn't see a lot of press coverage of, particularly in recent days, but of course I could have missed it, that the BRICS meeting that the Indonesian president went to was also part of Jokwi's first ever full country visit to Africa. So that also included Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania. And in these three countries, in addition to economic deals, the Indonesian president was also pushing for more trade and investment, following Mozambique's status as Indonesia's first preferential trade pact partner in Africa. So perhaps we could say that for some countries at present, BRICS, because there's not necessarily a clear charter, or a charter or clear goals, that for countries like Indonesia, amongst others, that joining BRICS is not the best option, or perhaps there are domestic concerns to consider.
We've got lots of questions coming in on our DMs here. So if you have a question for our panel as well, you'll be able to send that through to the Red Lines DMs, which you have in front of me. Max, one of the questions I have in front of me is around de-dollarization and Russia's push to be pitching this as effectively a big organization that will kick off and stop using the dollar, even having a united BRICS currency. Why did this fall on its face, and why are we unlikely to see this pop up in the next little while? Why would Russia be pushing so hard for this?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me clearly now.
Much better. That's not
Wonderful. The push that Russia has had for de-dollarization is something that Putin has believed in for a long time, but that has unsurprisingly escalated significantly over the last year and a half in response to the sanctioning of Russia's central bank and the effective discount applied to any other dollar earnings or hard currency earnings that it has. Structurally, Brics is not an organization that is really fit to replace this because the existing members are almost entirely very large surplus earners. So they all have significant savings that they need to export into deficit markets. Historically, that goes into the US. There's a reason why China and Japan, despite having very antithetical approaches to the US geopolitically, are the number one and number two holders of US treasuries. For the Brics, element to really succeed, they would need effective, large deficit markets that are also secure for those savings to be transferred into to really give it a currency base. Argentina and Egypt are, famously debtors that are not good on their payment issues and that have significant obligations to the IMF, amongst other Western institutions. Iran is, of course, also under similar US sanctions, not EU and international sanctions in the same way. But because of the extraterritoriality of the US sanctions, it also effectively causes them to be treated significantly differently by Europe. So, it wasn't surprising when it was dropped from the agenda before the summit began, but that comes, in my view, largely from Russia's demand and interest in seeing things this way, and is not something that is going to materialize anytime soon. China still has very tight capital controls and doesn't have an open capital account, isn't willing to change that even for Russia or other close partners. And I don't think Beijing sees the benefits of Brics as sufficient enough to do that in the long term.
So, Rachel, I'm going to throw a question we have here from in our DMs at the moment. Obviously, I don't think China, Russia, Iran, or Brazil is looking to give away the control currency mechanisms they have at the moment because they use them quite often. So what is the likelihood of having, let's say, a Brics currency backed by gold that all these nations can trade between themselves using rather than using US dollars?
So, I mean, that is something they could try to do. Then the question mark would be, I mean, you could create some kind of a basket currency. Attempts to do that at a global level have mostly not really gone anywhere. I mean, part of the reason things like the special drawing rights of the IMF haven't is because it can't be used in the secondary market. There were choices there. I think we're talking about creating quite, so there's a lot of infrastructure here, and it's also an element of sort of trust and believing and those kind of institutions. So it's something we could see them trying. What I'm also be watching for is whether there might be some extension of the Enbridge central bank digital currency sort of platform, whether there might start to be transactions there. What I think we'll see in the near term at best, right, sort of would be, or at most would be trying to, sort of start doing select, maybe bulky commodity trends, trades in sort of some sort of, alternate unit of account. But so far, there's really been a willingness, not much willingness to do so. And really, one of the challenges is we have been seeing an increase in trade settlement in the commodity market, particularly in renminbi and in other sort of non-dollar currencies. But still, the dollar, it's really hard to move away from the dollar as a unit of account, particularly as people want to sort of engage in and get in the best price. So it's possible they could create this alternate unit of account. They could create this sort of new basket. I mean, I think Max alluded to the fact that if that's really going to happen, we might see actual dollar peggers like the UAE and Saudi Arabia might need to start moving to some kind of a basket themselves. And really using this other unit of account requires these countries to move away from their perception of the sort of dollar as a source of stability and predictability, and to take on what's higher transactions costs. Now, if the US continues to sort of expand and target, say, major Chinese financial institutions, something that I don't think is on the Treasury's to-do list anytime soon, but if we look at an invasion of Taiwan scenario, could be sort of on the cards, that political impetus might increase and have a willingness to engage, to sort of take short-term losses. But my feeling is this sort of new unit of account is probably going to be quite slow in developing and really be much more of a pilot project than something that has a lot of volume of trade in it. Because part of it is also you need not only to sort of have you need to also issue securities and the like. You need to have bonds and trading instruments. There's a lot of sort of structure required here to move beyond just sort of something sort of short term that you translate into that currency before you move, but before you sort of go back into dollars. And so there's a reason why, as Max highlighted, that there's been a lot of interest in de-dollarization in the past, why this, hasn't been implemented. And so I think it's likely to continue to be slow, given the difficulties establishing the infrastructure, the trust, and just the financial plumbing.
So we are coming toward the end of the panel here this evening, so I'm going to do a bit of a wraparound and get everyone's final thoughts on where Brics is at the moment and where it's going. So Genevieve, I'm going to start with you. Where do you see Brics as an organization in, let's say, 5 years' time? Does it get bigger? Does it get more important? Or does it end up just becoming another one of those acronyms that diplomats go to and it makes a lot of hotels around the region very rich?
I think that we will still see new members. We might consider 6 members that joined as perhaps a testing or as a test or a trial, but from what we've heard that there are up to 40 countries interested. So I think that perhaps within the next 5 years, we'll see more countries wanting to join.
Max, in a bit of a 90-second wraparound, where do you think this organization is going over the next 5 or so years?
I think it will continue to make headlines. I don't think any of the key institutional changes that we outlined, whether it's significant new lending or alternate currencies, will realize themselves. The new development bank has loaned less in its 5 years of existence than the World Bank does in half a year, and that's not even, considering the IMF. What I would say is a lot of the countries, including the ones who have, recently agreed to be members, are also taking part in reform efforts and updating efforts in some of those traditional Bretton Woods institutions. Saudi Arabia had a big success with its G20 summit, leading to the common framework for sovereign debt restructurings. India's been involved with that. So, in 5 years, I still think we'll be talking about Brics, but increasingly, hopefully, more focus on probably its failures and its challenges. And I do ultimately expect it to end up on the heap of other similar efforts to challenge the international economic order of the last 50 years. And if it changes, it may well change in our lifetime, but it won't be Brics that does it.
Well, I'm sure we'll do a space on it when it does. Rachel, where do you think the organization is going to be going over the next, let's say, 10 years? And do you think it will become more of a anti-US and that is its core message, or this is going to be a purely financial cross-trade border organization?
Well, it's definitely not going to be just a purely financial one. I think from its get-go, there's been an element about challenging the Western-dominated financial order. That being said, a lot of the members, existing and new ones coming in, have important ties with the U.S., with the European Union, and aren't willing to completely sort of jettison it. So I tend to think, yes, it will get bigger, but that means that what the Brics does as an overarching group might stay fairly limited, and so that there might be other sort of smaller groups that sort of emerge out of these regular meetings that actually address things, whether it's on critical minerals or especially on food security or pilot projects on the sort of financial side. But I think a lot of that might just happen from bilateral interests regardless, sort of joint investments from sovereign funds and the like. So yes, 5 years from now probably still exists. International institutions, once they're created, tend to persist. But I think also a lot of it depends on what happens and how the US and China manage their economic competition, how united the the G7 stays on particularly issues relating to China. All these things are going to sort of impact how Brics evolves. And of course, we've spent 45 minutes talking about the Brics without sort of saying that with all these new members, they probably need a new name. And so that in and of itself, plus details coming out of what accession really looks like, that's going to be a key metric for us to watch about whether there's action that implements the rhetoric we've been seeing. Sorry, way more than 90 seconds.
Look, it's all good information, so I'm still happy. So thanks to everyone who tuned in to this Twitter space. It's an absolute pleasure to be chatting with everyone tonight. Joining us tonight was Maximilian Hess, Rachel Ziemba, and Genevieve Donnellon-May. It's been an absolutely amazing panel and really nice to be chatting with everyone about Brics and a bit of a summary here. But in the meantime, thank you so much for everyone who tuned in or sent questions through. And thank you so much to our panelists for giving us our time to talk about a really interesting subject.